bench 5, check on the nut tightness. Nuts coming through loose on bench 5. Attention, foreman. Back. Section 5, more speed, 4-7. Relief man passing. Relief man passing. Quit stalling. Get back to work. Go on.
Welcome once again to The Radical Imagination. I'm your host, Jim Vrettos, and I'm a sociologist who's taught at John Jay College of Criminal Justice and Yeshiva University here in New York. The history of labor and worker struggles in America has been intense and bloody, complicated, and intimately intertwined with the unresolved agonies and struggles of other movements in the country's history. The fight for decent lives for workers has always been tied to issues of racism and slavery, technological control over our lives and privacy, gender and women's rights, class and poverty, ecological devastation, imperialist wars, a humane social welfare state, the nature of work and leisure time, greed, profit, and regulation of labor markets, voting rights and suppression, the right to collectively bargain and unionize, immigration policies, human rights and happiness, the ultimate possibility of our spiritual and material well-being. Labor struggles and the nature of workers' lives have always been central to what America's about and what it could be. In most industrial nations, with the notable exception of the United States, most labor movements have sponsored its own political parties. As Noam Chomsky recently put it, we don't use the term working class here because it's a taboo term. You're supposed to say middle class because it helps diminish the understanding there's a class war going on. Cloward and Piven, in their classic work, The New Class War, argue that, quote, in simple terms and human terms, the social welfare state has reduced some of the hardships and insecurities generated by a continually changing market economy that cuts off the people it no longer needs, like any other surplus commodity. The programs have come to intrude upon the dynamics of the labor market and augment the power of workers. The programs of the social welfare state are the fruits of these struggles. And many of these fruits came out of a long, arduous, historical struggle of and by ordinary, everyday workers who attempted to organize and unionize to challenge a workplace and society that attempted to diminish their human rights and dignity at every turn. Traditionally, this organizing meant espousing a set of values. Solidarity was central, the sense that each should look out for the interests of all. And that meant mutual assistance, better wages, benefits and working conditions for all, establishing the 40-hour work week, minimum wage, a rough and ready sense of fairness and equity for all within the workforce, a disdain for elitism, and a belief in democracy and individual rights didn't stop at the plant gate or the office reception room. The reality is, however, the U.S. labor movement and its influence has been declining for many decades. Union membership peaked at 1/3 of the workforce in the 1950s. Then began a long decline that's accelerated since the 1970s with globalization, automation, and a renewed corporate anti-union offensive. Today, union membership is about 10% of the workforce, a little over 6% in the private sector. For full-time workers, it's 11.6%. For part-timers, it's less than half that number at 5.4%. 27 states, largely in the South, Midwest, and the interior West, are considered right-to-work states, which allow employees to work in unionized workplaces without actually joining the union or paying regular union dues. Can labor save itself? What does the revival of socialism in America mean for the labor movement? Can we identify the issues and concepts for considering the development of a full-blown left labor strategy? How do we battle and counter the myths about unions, argued and spread to destroy its influence and power? What are some visions of a possible new world? To help us grapple with and understand some possible answers, we're so fortunate to have on the Radical Imagination today a guest who is one of the major activist visionaries in the country on these issues. He's a longtime racial justice, labor, and international activist, scholar, and author. He's been involved in the labor movement for decades, is a widely known speaker and writer in print and on radio, television, and the web. He's served in leadership positions with many prominent union and labor organizations, including the AFL-CIO and the Service Employees International Union, and he's currently the Director of Field Services for the American Federation of Government Employees. He's also served a number of years on the board of the Left Forum. Among his major works are The Indispensable Ally, Black Workers, and the Formation of the Congress of Industrial Relations, 1934 to 1941. They're Bankrupting Us, and 20 other myths about unions, and Solidarity Defined, the crisis in organized labor, and a new path towards social justice. Most recently, he's written a riveting crime novel called The Man Who Fell from the Sky. I've read and admired his work for years, but only met him for the first time in person at the recent 100th year celebration of the Communist Party USA, where he presented a lively and provocative challenge to the party and the progressive left in general. I'm so glad he's here, and he graciously accepted our invitation to be on the show. Welcome, Bill Fletcher Jr. to the Radical Imagination.
Thank you. It's great to be on the program. And just one slight correction.
Sure.
I'm no longer the Director of Field Services and Education for the American Federation of Government Employees. That was a number of years ago.
Okay.
But thank you very much for
corrected.
the introduction.
And you're no longer on the board of the Left Forum, right? That's
No.
true. But we'll get into that as well,
Right.
perhaps later on. So it was such a pleasure to see you and listen to your talk at the recent 100th anniversary of the Communist Party, birth of the Communist Party USA. Tell me a little about what you were trying to accomplish there. What was the main thrust of your message at that time during the celebration?
So I had a few things that I was trying to accomplish. One was obviously to congratulate them on 100 years. The second was really to emphasize that it's not enough to celebrate one's history. One has to be thinking about the future and has to be thinking about what forms of organization are necessary in this moment and going into the future. And in the case of the Communist Party, what is its relationship and what should its relationship be with the rest of the left? We have increasing interest in socialism in this country. We have a radicalization that's going on, a kind of mass left radicalism that has emerged over the last several years. And I guess the question is then, how does the Communist Party relate to that? And with the other point is that we have to accept the fact. Hello?
Hi. So go right ahead, though.
Okay, so one of the things I was trying to get across is that there is and has been globally a crisis of socialism. There's been a challenge about how to assess the 20th century experience of socialism, the pros and the cons, the errors, the successes, the challenge of trying to win power in advanced capitalist countries. We've got to face those realities. And so I was saying to the Communist Party, it's not enough to celebrate the past. We have to reflect upon it. And then we use that in terms of going forward and thinking new strategies, new forms of organization.
Okay. All right. Actually, just for a second, let's go back to the past briefly for our audience to give us an idea of why there was such a need for workers to organize. Give us some background into those very early struggles. And then
why it was necessary for workers to organize unions?
Yeah, and to fight back against what they were experiencing here in the workplace as they attempted to survive.
So I think it's important for people to understand that workers have always engaged in struggle with their employers since well before unions ever came into existence. And in some cases, it wasn't employers, it was owners. So if you look at the United States alone, from the moment that the Europeans started colonizing North America, you had, once there was a labor force, that labor force was treated abysmally. In some cases, that labor force were indentured servants. In other cases, they were slaves. Mm-hmm. In still other cases, they were indentured servants and then became slaves, if they were African. And in that situation, this workforce was in constant rebellion. And they formed organizations to gain some level of freedom.
And protection, obviously.
That's right.
From the vagaries of this market system, the early market system.
It was sometimes very violent, like armed uprisings, like Bacon's Rebellion. In other cases, it was less violent. But one of the things that we have to keep in mind about the United States, which has been masked in the histories that we've been told, is that we actually have the most violent history of labor-capital relations of any advanced capitalist country. And that is because of the attitude that the employer class has taken towards workers insisting upon their rights. That generally speaking, you'd see it decade after decade, when workers have insisted, almost always beginning peacefully and not asking for very much, but asking for their rights and for justice, they have been met with repression. And ultimately, this led to the formation of what we now understand to be trade unions.
Tribunals.
Trade unions.
Trade unions, yes, exactly. And again, to bring in the police and the beginnings of the criminal justice system, that was one of the first things the police were asked to do, correct? Break up strikes.
The police emerge out of slave patrols and militias.
Right.
And the slave patrols were obviously there to squash the slaves, and the militias were there to enforce the order of the state, plus to exterminate Native Americans. And over time, when you have a formal police force that's brought into existence, one of the objectives of the police and ultimately the state militias was to ensure that workers did not get out of control. And so I'll give you an example. One thing that I grew up in New York, and I would remember driving through Manhattan as a kid and seeing these castles. That's what they look like to me as a kid, and thinking, wow, this is like really amazing. Castles in Manhattan, only to find out years later that there were armories.
Armories, right.
And that they had been placed in the cities not to protect New York against a foreign invasion, but in case workers started to rebel. So the National Guard, what we now know as the National Guard, and the police had a major mission of suppressing workers when workers rebelled, whether the rebellion was peaceful or not. And this is one of the things that, even though, quite ironically, many police are unionized and engage in collective bargaining, when their role as an organization is more often than not to suppress workers when they're attempting to organize.
Absolutely, absolutely. Now, the real heyday, if you will, of movements, the labor movement, was during the Great Depression, correct? And Basically, okay. And that was a result of what sort of organizing? Going back to the Communist Party, the Socialist Party at that time. They were very, very important in those early struggles, correct?
Yes, absolutely. The organizing from the early 1930s through about 1946, 47,
right,
was very influenced by several different things. One was that in the first decade of the 20th century, you had the emergence of a radical form of unionism led by the industrial workers of the world, so-called Wobblies. And the IWW was, as it turns out, a major training ground for trade union activists and leaders who would go on, in many cases in the 20s and 30s, to play critical roles in the development of a new union movement. Harry Bridges, the iconic figure who led in the building of the West Coast Dock Workers Union, which came to be known as the International Longshore and Warehouse Union, came out of an IWW-affiliated a maritime union. So you had this organizing that was going on, and in the aftermath of the Russian Revolution of 1917, a radical wing of the Socialist Party split off and formed the Communist Party. The Communist Party grew slowly in the 1920s, partly through mergers, and then, but during the 1920s, they engaged in a lot of work within the trade union movement. Some of it was within established unions, and in other cases, they set up separate unions because they concluded that the established unions were too bankrupt. But in the 1930s, in the context of the Depression, a split took place in the American Federation of Labor, and it was led by the leader of the United Mine Workers, John L. Lewis, and others who came to a conclusion that even though they themselves were not anti-capitalists, that if there was going to be a union movement in the United States, that something dramatically different had to happen. And it necessitated a massive organizing of the mass production industries, like steel, auto, rubber, shipyards. And they turned to radicals, communists, socialists, Trotskyists, and others, Mustites, and they basically said, we need your help. You, because of your dedication to workers, your experience, etc., we need your help in organizing a new union movement. And thousands of activists entered in one way or another in helping to build this new movement. And there was this dramatic growth. And then in World War II, the growth was assisted in some ways by revisions in labor laws, making it easier for unions to form. But after World War II, with the United States and Britain initiating the Cold War, there was a pushback against unions that led to both a civil war within the Congress of Industrial Organizations, but also led to almost freezing of the strategic organizing that unions have been doing. And I would argue that we've been in a retreat ever since the late 40s.
The late 40s. What's been the role of immigration? Again, going back to the 20s and 30s, 1880, 1920, 20 million, largely white ethnics, make their way over, forced to migrate, come to America. What is the role of these immigrants in these movements as well?
Well, that's really an interesting question. Because there were unions and union federations like the IWW that openly embraced immigrants and made a point of saying, we're not restricting entrance to anybody. And they were particularly good on the race question in terms of organizing. But they organized all kinds of immigrants, whether from Mexico or from Italy. The American Federation of Labor was not very sanguine about immigrants. And they fell prey to various forms of xenophobia. The founding president of the American Federation of Labor, Gompers, Samuel Gompers, began his career as a socialist and ended as a full-blown white supremacist and xenophobe. And so there was a resistance in many quarters within labor to immigrants. But a lot of that changes in certain key industries, textile and garment, for example, where you had the introduction of immigrants, unions that wanted to grow needed to embrace immigrants, and immigrants became a major force in the revitalization of the U.S. trade union movement.
And all through the 50s, as we mentioned, roughly a third of the workforce are unionized. So then you have the beginning of the decline. And then, of course, you have the agitation and the activism of the 60s, which you and I have been involved in. You were a welder, is that correct?
I was a welder in the 1970s in a shipyard. That's correct.
Okay, all right.
I graduated from college and decided I wanted to get into the labor movement, and that's how I did it.
Okay, all right. And so, again, as you have said and written so eloquently, this is not the 60s and 70s. But what was the, anymore obviously, what was going on there that really affected the labor movement as well? The growth of the civil rights movement, the activism there, the Black Panthers in particular, which you've written a lot about, and the development of these so-called survival programs.
Right. Well, in order to answer that, you have to go back, though, to the late 40s and early 50s. Because what happens in response to the Cold War and the passage of the Taft-Hartley Act in 1947, which goes into effect in 48, is what I described before as a retreat. The CIO's efforts to organize the South, what was called Operation Dixie, were halted after, in effect, 1 year of trying to organize. And it was, the organizing was, there were so many problems in their approach. The United Auto Workers, in effect, gave up the fight for a more stronger social benefits for the working class as a whole, and focused its work on collective bargaining, with the idea being that if workers want a stronger living standard, they need to join a union. But that missed the point that even though it was more than a third of the workforce was unionized, of the non-agricultural, non-domestic service workforce was unionized, that still meant that 2/3 at least were non-union and needed social benefits. So
which they weren't, I'm sorry, which they weren't necessarily interested at that point in going after and organizing.
Well, that was the point, that in part in response to the Cold War. And
Vietnam, right? And Vietnam.
Well, no, I'm talking about in the 50s.
Okay.
In part in response to the Cold War, the officialdom in organized labor froze. It developed a very strange view of the world, where they basically concluded that they were strong enough in order to be able to influence mainstream America, that they did not need to engage in strategic organizing. They did not need to organize the South and the Southwest, that their base areas in the Northeast, Midwest, and West Coast were enough. So that's what I meant by a freezing in position. And this idea that that was very much represented by George Meany, the first president of the merged AFL-CIO, this idea that the union movement shouldn't force itself upon workers. Believe it or not, that was basically his terminology. So you had that, and a restriction in the vision of trade unionism under people like Meany to wages, hours, and working conditions, but staying away from the broader social issues that the union movement had been fighting for in the 1930s and 40s. By the 1960s, what happens is that the workforce is starting to change. You have a greater introduction of women workers in broader ranges of the workforce, greater numbers of people of color. You have introductions of new technologies, and you slowly, by the late 60s, have growing competition with capitalists in other parts of the world. And the U.S. trade union movement did not respond to that. Then what you have in an alternative was that, in part because of the civil rights movement, Black Power movement, anti-Vietnam War movement, Puerto Rican independence movement, Chicano movement, women's movement, etc., you had the emergence of militancy and radicalism that ends up penetrating the workforce.
Right.
And having an impact as a counter to the conservatism of mainstream trade unionism. Yeah. So what the way that played out was, for example, what was called the Caucus Movement. You had groups like the League of Revolutionary Black Workers that was formed in Detroit that challenged the United Auto Workers. You had the emergence of groups like the Coalition of Labor Union Women, Coalition of Black Trade Unionists, and others that started pushing a different kind of agenda on trade unionism. But the problem was that no matter how important these formations were, and no matter how significant their contributions, and the organizing that some unions did in the South and the Southwest, it did not reach the tipping point in order to shift U.S. trade unionism in a more leftward direction.
So in other words, they became more complacent, if you will, conservative,
Yeah.
And have continued to do so, to be that way until fairly recently, where we need now.
That's right.
Go ahead.
Until the late 80s, early 90s, when a number of unions started to realize that something different had to happen. Like, for example, in the Service Employees International Union, the union started losing its base in the janitorial industry, which actually had been its core when it was founded. And they were losing their base because of changes in the way that the janitorial industry was functioning. And it was in that situation that certain enlightened leaders, what we would call, what my co-author in Solidarity Divided, Fernando Gapacin, and I would call pragmatists, leaders like John Sweeney, decided that something needed to be done. And in order to do that, they were willing to embrace elements of the left to help in efforts at a revitalization of the trade union movement. So SEIU, in some parts of the American Federation of State, County, Municipal Employees, the Communication Workers of America, and some other unions, there was a turn towards some efforts at transforming the way the unions were operating. But I would argue that the transformation process was very, very uneven. And it was failing to recognize that, to a great extent, most of the union movement remained trapped in a framework that had been established by Gompers.
Right.
And that they failed to recognize that there was a need for a revitalization, not only of the unions as organizations, but a revitalization of trade unionism itself.
A framework. By that you also mean a worldview.
Correct.
Correct? And what we need, as you've written again so eloquently in so many of your work, a new energy that connects to that. And you talk about a third Reconstruction, for example.
Mm-hmm. Correct.
And your admiration for Moral Mondays and the Poor People's Campaign, Reverend Barber.
That's right.
So these are sort of things that, again, these are other movements, the growing ecology movement among young people, especially today. These are all examples of the sort of energy that labor organizing and unions need to try to incorporate, correct?
Correct.
In order to revitalize and move us forward into some of the visionary ideals the original labor movements were attempting to achieve.
No, that's right. We need a revitalization within our ranks and a revitalization that leads us to embrace other movements.
Right.
But we have to understand that within our own ranks, the revitalization really is a transformation. You know, in our book, Solidarity Divided, we use this analogy with a tire that has a slow leak. And this has been the problem of much of the union movement. You know, you come out to your car in the morning and you notice there's a slow leak. And so you go to the gas station, you put some air in the tire, and the car is fine. You go out the next morning and you see that the tire is low again. You go to the gas station and you put air in. Now the problem is that you can do this for quite a while until you have a catastrophic blowout, because the fundamental problem is that there's something wrong in the tire, and the tire itself needs to be repaired or replaced. And that every time you put the air in, that's good for that moment. But because you're not addressing the fundamentals in the tire is going to continue to lose air. That's the problem in the trade union movement. That in the 1990s, efforts such as those undertaken by John Sweeney, who then becomes the president of the AFL-CIO until 2009. They were very important efforts, and there were a lot of really great things that happened. But at the same time, there was a failure to grapple with that there were some fundamentals that really needed to change in the way that unions saw themselves in terms of the issues that they raised, their internal education, the resources that go into organizing, the way that they went into organizing, the kind of alliances that needed to be created. This called for a real rethinking of trade unionism. And to a great extent, much of the officialdom in organized labor froze. They weren't willing to make that move.
And in addition, actually you reminded me that I have one tire I need to fix. I have a plug in it, so thanks for reminding me on that. But also, you need to, obviously, we need to take into consideration the pushback, the enormous resistance, the capital finance market that has been so aggressively attacking unions, and the nature of work. And
absolutely.
So again, this new energy has to take those new realities into mind as it furthers the struggle.
Well, I think it's really, your point is very, very important. And for the listeners and viewers, what they have to recognize is that, so one, the employer class has always been hostile towards unions.
Right.
That doesn't mean that every individual employer has, but the employer class as a whole has. And that particularly since the 1970s, the hostility has evolved into a full-blown offensive against unions and against any form of legitimate worker organization. And this caught much of the officialdom in organized labor by surprise. I often analogized it to the way that the French General Staff responded to the German invasion of France in 1940. They never expected the Germans to get past the Maginot Line. And when the Germans did, by circumventing it, the French General Staff had no strategy. They had no idea what to do, and they retreated and then surrendered. To a great extent, when the offensive against workers unfolds in the 1970s and really goes into high gear in the 1980s with the capitalist fundamentalism that we've experienced, otherwise known as neoliberalism, many of the union leaders simply could not accept that this was happening. Some of them thought that you could bluff your way back into politics by threatening some sort of labor insurgency. But they didn't realize that capital had decided that the time had come for the final offensive against workers and their unions. And that's what we've been experiencing.
Yeah, exactly. And they gave up on the possibility of organizing in the South, for example, and other places. And so they gave up in the challenge that they were faced with, in a sense. Right. And to organize the unemployed and so on, the underemployed and so on. So where do we go from it? You've written about resurgence of socialism. Bernie has certainly helped in that resurgence. Ocasio-Cortez obviously has. What do you see the connection between this new interest in socialism and a larger left struggle and creating this worldview that we need to have?
I think that many younger people have come to see our system as not only toxic, but as a threat to the future of humanity. And as a result, increasing interest in this general category called socialism. There's no consensus as to what is meant by the term. For some people, it means a new welfare state. For other people, it means a radical reconstruction of the United States. But in either case, increasing numbers of people are saying there is something really flawed with this system and we have to do something about it. Now, this becomes very important for the trade union movement. And one of the things that I've been arguing is that the trade union movement will not reemerge unless there's a left that is integrated into helping rebuild it. And by the same token, a left that is not rooted among working class people is going to be a group of chorus singers who are singing wonderful tunes and hoping that the sound of their voice will be influential, but will lack power. And so it's really important that the socialism that we're talking about is rooted in the struggles of the dispossessed. And I think we need to think about that term, the dispossessed. We're talking about working class people. We're talking about people who have been declassed from the professional managerial class. We're talking about the farmers and those that have worked the land. The dispossessed are looking for alternatives, and they're looking for something that is humane. And socialism should be just that, and our left needs to be rooted among that population, and that population needs to see itself as part of that left. The rebuilding of the trade union movement necessitates that an understanding exists that there is no returning to 1965 or 1955. There's no that the relationship between the employer class and the unions during those periods was based on a whole series of factors, not the least being that there had been a strong movement built in the 30s and 40s, but also the unique situation the United States was in at that point. But globally, capital is engaged in a war against workers and wants to eliminate us. And when you're engaged in such a fight, you can't simply hit back when you're attacked. You have to engage in a fight while it's happening with the intent on taking down your opponent. And what taking down means needs to be defined strategically. But we can't be sitting back simply on the defensive. No good fighter ever wins a fight remaining on the defensive. At some point, you have to come out and smack the other side, and smack them so hard that they either retreat to their corner or they fall. And that's our situation.
Absolutely. And begin to appeal to the forces that Trump is appealing to. Not
in some cases.
In some cases.
Some cases.
Okay.
It's like some of Trump's supporters are people who are just simply very confused and frustrated. A lot of his supporters aren't confused and frustrated at all. They are zombies. They are people who have given up on their humanity. They are largely more well-to-do whites who fear, and I don't mean just rich whites, but more well-to-do whites, who fear the transformation of this country, the demographic transformation, who basically asked the question, which I think was at the core of the Trump campaign, of does it pay to be white anymore in the United States? And you see, the core of that group, they're not people that are going to be part of our movement. And they'd be better off going onto some island somewhere because they're not interested in the future. They look to the future in the past.
Right.
I've often said that that many of us quickly realized that when Trump was saying "Make America Great Again," he was saying "Make America White Again." That's almost become a cliche. But I would go further than that. I'd say that really what he was saying was make America leave it to Beaver again. Make the United States the 1950s, which is a critical image for the right wing. It's a moment for the right wing where men were men, boys were boys, women were girls, blacks and other peoples of color were inconsequential as far as the right wing was concerned. This is what Trump wishes to reestablish, and he has millions of people that are quite happy with that vision. Right. So I'm not interested in uniting with zombies. Anyone that watches a good horror movie knows zombies can never return to humanity. We have to make sure that humans don't turn into zombies.
Exactly. So again, the rollback of the culture wars that we have been dealing with, identity politics, again, to go back to a much more homogenized 1950s blander world.
You know what? I would frame it a different way. I've had mixed feelings about this notion of the term cultural wars, and certainly people mean any number of things under identity politics. I think what it really is a battle about democracy. Yeah. You know, that we on the left, as a great theorist once said, need to be the advocates of consistent democracy. And consistent democracy means not simply voting rights and expansion of the franchise. It means democracy permeating into all facets of society. So it means that people who are gay, lesbian, trans, queer, whatever, that they not only don't have to remain in the closet, but are free participants in society. This is not culture. This is about democracy. And I think we've got to frame it as that. Because, you know, it's like when we talk about the cultural wars, sometimes that leads some people to believe that there's two legitimate sides. You know, the more conservative, you know, I'm not so comfortable with gays and lesbians, and the more progressive who is saying, no, you know, you're entitled to rights. And no, it's not about personal comfort. It's about to what extent do you have a democratic country versus one or another form of authoritarianism.
I think that's a great point. I think that's actually the chapter 1 of the New Class War that I quoted from is entitled Capitalism Against Democracy. So that is a struggle. Now, Bill, we've got just a few minutes, and I promised you I wanted to talk about your new crime novel. So please tell us a little about that's about it. It's a riveting
Thank you.
Crime novel as well as a political drama. So
thank you.
Take off on it. Yeah.
It's called The Man Who Fell from the Sky.
Right.
It's published by Hardball Press, which is in New York. And it's a story of race, justice, revenge, and this population called Cape Verdeans, who were the first post-1492 African population to come to the United States voluntarily. And they came beginning in the 19th century from the Cape Verde archipelago, which is 500 miles off the coast of Senegal in West Africa. And they were, Cape Verde was controlled by Portugal up until 1975. And the Cape Verdeans came as whalers and fishermen, and they brought their families, etc. So my story takes us back to an incident in World War II, but it starts with the murder of this white construction contractor in Cape Cod, Massachusetts, who was shot and killed with a high-powered silenced rifle. And a Cape Verdean American journalist and an Italian American police officer who was a friend of his, a detective, they begin investigating this murder. And from that, the reader is taken into a story about other murders, but also a story about Cape Verdean Americans and issues of identity, issues of race. But as I mentioned in the beginning, the thin line between justice and revenge, and the issues of complicity. At what point, and this is one issue relevant to the United States, at what point do you grapple with your history? And is it enough to say, I will be good from now on if I committed a heinous crime in the past? Do I need to do anything about that? Or is simply by being quote unquote good, is that enough? And so the book grapples with that, and I had a lot of fun with it, and the response has been phenomenal.
Well, it's so totally appropriate. We're taping this, by the way, on Yom Kippur, the holiest day of atonement. So I think your point is well taken. Are you going to be coming to New York for a book launch on this, or?
Oh, I've done a couple of book events in New York.
Okay.
And because I'm dealing with a small publisher, and one of the things that has happened in the book world, whether you have a small publisher or even big publishers, is that they don't put you on the road.
Okay.
And so I have to go, usually in connection with speaking engagements, and this is not a criticism because my publisher has been fantastic.
Right.
And I've learned so much about writing fiction through my publisher, Tim Sherry.
Right. Well, listen, let's get you up here. You're in Washington right now, and let's do this again because you've been so informative. It's been terrific. Bill, I look forward to doing this again real soon. Your book sounds riveting. It's something we all need to read about. Take care, and we'll see you again next week. Thank you so much, Bill.
Thank you very much. Take care.
All right. All the best. Bye. And thank you so much for watching The Radical Imagination. We're going to go out now with Solidarity Forever. See you again next week. This is Jim Vrettos.
Solidarity forever. Solidarity forever. Solidarity forever. For the union makes us strong. When the union's inspiration through the workers' blood shall run, there can be no power greater anywhere beneath the sun. Yet what force on earth is weaker than the feeble strength of one? But the union makes us strong. Solidarity forever. Solidarity forever. Solidarity forever. For the union makes us strong. It is we who plowed the prairies, built the cities where they trade, dug the mines and built the workshops, endless miles of railroad laid. Now we stand outcast and starving mid the wonders we have made, but the union makes us strong. Solidarity forever. Solidarity forever. Solidarity forever. For the union makes us strong. They have taken untold millions that they never toiled to earn, but without our brain and muscle not a single wheel can turn. We can break their haughty power, gain our freedom when we learn that the union makes us strong. Solidarity forever. Solidarity forever. Solidarity forever. For the union makes us strong. In our hands is placed a power greater than their hoarded gold, greater than the might of atoms, magnified 1,000-fold. We can bring to birth a new world from the ashes of the old, for the union makes us strong.